For nearly 15 years, I've been cultivating a garden. That span represents more than a third of my existence. My aim in this video today is to spare you time, expense, and many of the setbacks I encountered throughout 15 years, filled with errors, lessons learned, triumphs, and all the rest. If I had the chance to advise my younger self, this is the guidance I would have offered. My aspiration here is that you can take this decade and a half of practical experience and utilize all the insights for your future garden. In doing so, you could almost fast-track your way to a thriving garden. Let's dive straight in by discussing location selection. While this might not be the most thrilling starting point, it is undoubtedly a crucial one. Ultimately, sunlight is always a necessity. It could potentially become the limiting factor for your plant's growth if you lack a sufficient amount when aiming for healthy vegetables and fruits. What's required is around 6 to 8 hours of sun each day for them to flourish. In my location in the Northern Hemisphere, within the United States, the sun emerges in the east, climbs high overhead during summer, essentially directly above us, and then descends in the west. Knowing this is important for the summer months. However, during spring and autumn, the sun assumes a lower position in the southern sky. Therefore, if feasible, having a south-facing garden is always advantageous. This ensures that in summer, the sun is overhead, and when it dips lower in the fall and spring, your garden still maintains good access to that light. When all is said and done, you can always generate shade using shade cloths, or even employing trees and similar elements to create some shade for yourself, but you cannot generate additional sun. This scenario might differ slightly if you reside further south where temperatures are extremely high. You folks might lack abundant trees. In fact, you might contend with excessive sun. Consequently, your geographical location is a significant factor concerning sun exposure. But if you live in a region like mine, Zone 7A, you should seek the spot receiving the most sun exposure and facing south. That approach will yield the best outcomes for you. So, another consideration involves trees and their root systems. If you're simply in a backyard setting with some large trees, your objective is to ensure you aren't planting extremely close to them, as the roots of those trees could deprive your own plants of considerable nourishment and water. You can observe some of your trees to gauge the appropriate planting distance. A tree's roots will typically reach at least as far as its branches spread. Hence, you need to position your garden beyond that reach, perhaps even 10 feet outside the branch extent, because the roots likely extend even farther. So when it comes down to it, examine the trees present in your backyard and then be certain not to establish your garden directly beneath them. Another aspect to contemplate is the microclimates existing within your property. A south-facing slope, for instance, will warm up much more rapidly in the spring due to its orientation, compared to a slope potentially facing north, which will heat up considerably slower. Furthermore, low-lying areas in your garden might act as frost pockets. When cold weather arrives, the colder air will descend to these lower spots and accumulate there. Thus, these can form small frost pockets. What you can do is venture out, monitor your microclimates, and leverage them to your benefit, rather than having them impede your efforts. Wind is another factor. If you reside in a particularly windy area, you'll want to either establish windbreaks by cultivating sunflowers or planting a hedge or similar barrier. Just ensure you're considering wind, as very strong gusts can harm many of your plants, particularly the younger ones. So, it's simply something to keep in mind when selecting a suitable location. Additionally, if you intend to plant directly in the ground, drainage becomes a concern. You should choose a spot with relatively effective drainage. If you have a location in mind for a garden, just monitor that spot for a period and confirm that water doesn't accumulate in that area. If water pools in that section, you'll encounter difficulties growing things. When water accumulates and cannot drain efficiently, it actually displaces the air from the soil, leading to insufficient oxygen. Your plants require oxygen, and they won't have access to it. Therefore, ensure that when choosing a location, you don't observe significant flooding or pooling in that specific spot. Another point relates to access. You must ensure your garden is reachable for you, and you must have access to water for it. So, if you possess a large property, placing the garden way out in the far back corner isn't advisable because its accessibility will be compromised. Permaculture ranks among my preferred gardening styles, and within permaculture, we discuss various zones. You plan your gardens according to these zones, based on their distance from your house. For example, in Zone 1 of permaculture garden design, you place the items you'll use most frequently closest to your residence. So, if you have, let's say, parsley and some other herbs, you'd want them right beside your house so that when you need those herbs, you don't have to traverse the entire property to retrieve them. One of my favorite gardeners and permaculturist, Bill Mollison, used to say that if you must get your slippers wet fetching an herb, then it's too far away. Because in the morning, while preparing eggs or something similar, if it's too distant and requires wetting your slippers, you might forgo going out to get that herb. So just consider access when establishing your garden, access to water, and personal access for you to go out and gather things. It might not seem overly important, but it's definitely something that needs to be considered. One of the final considerations regarding location selection is not to think solely about the current year. Think about the future. As you get your garden established, contemplate future expansion and how you might develop that garden, allowing it to grow alongside your own growth as a gardener. So perhaps you envision a spot being suitable for a greenhouse down the road, or you might start a few beds here initially and then expand into another section later. Therefore, don't limit your thinking to just this year. I often say, avoid adopting a purely annual mindset. Ensure you're thinking with a perennial perspective. Next, let's discuss selecting a size for your garden. If you're a novice gardener, I consistently invariably recommend starting small. You might perceive a small garden negatively, but in reality, a large garden can often be disadvantageous, particularly when beginning. A larger garden equates to more area and more plants. Yes, but it also translates to increased upkeep, more watering, and generally much more work, which could prove slightly excessive if you're just starting out. When beginning, the primary objective is simply to achieve some harvests. Then, you can experience the excitement, taste the food, build that impetus, and subsequently expand your garden in the future. Expansion isn't difficult, but taking on too much in the first year can become daunting. My suggestion is to start modestly with just, for example, one raised bed measuring 4 feet by 8 feet. That's an excellent starting point, allowing you to cultivate a substantial amount of food without becoming overwhelming. I also advocate starting in a raised bed for several reasons. One is that raised beds are handy to work in. They will warm up faster for you in the spring. You won't be battling against the indigenous earth. So, if you live in a place with native soil that simply isn't good quality, you won't have to contend with that if you cultivate in a raised bed. You can construct your own soil, which we'll discuss later, or just acquire some quality bags of soil. This makes starting much simpler when you have a solid base of healthy soil, rather than fighting against what you have natively. Then, once you gain more knowledge about soil and what fosters healthy plant growth, you can enlarge your garden either by adding more raised beds or undertaking more in-ground planting. The concept is for you to become your own gardening instructor and your own problem solver. I heard someone remark that some individuals are curious, and that's the trait you need for gardening. Curious people don't just want to know that a watch ticks. They desire to understand what makes the watch tick. So, that same inquisitiveness is necessary for your garden. You don't merely want to know, oh, those plants are growing well. You want to comprehend why those plants are thriving so that you can duplicate that situation and achieve success throughout your entire garden. So, strive to become your own garden teacher. It will assist you immensely. It will make a significant difference for you. Something often neglected when people first establish gardens is their actual paths. If you plan to install more than one raised bed, having multiple units, you don't want to just place everything immediately adjacent to each other, thinking, oh, I only need about 6 inches apart, this way I can fit through. But that's undesirable. Ideally, you want something like 12 or even 18 inches of space between them, and you also need to consider the future, because you'll be applying mulch to these beds. So, you might want to leave sufficient width between your beds, which is my preference, so that you can maneuver a wheelbarrow through. This way, when you want to add mulch around your beds, say wood chips or leaves, you can bring the wheelbarrow and scoop it in. If you don't leave adequate space, you'll be forced to do something like filling 5-gallon buckets with wood chips and then carrying those individually to your garden to dump into your bed. So it will simply be much more difficult if you don't provide yourself with proper spacing for walkways. It might seem like a minor detail, but having appropriate spacing helps considerably. If you lack ample space and only have a patio or similar area, that's perfectly fine. You can simply grow plants in pots. I enjoy growing plants in containers. It functions very effectively. You can purchase your own containers, like a conventional garden container, a clay pot, or if preferred, you can use grow bags. Those work well. They just tend to dry out a bit faster than some standard pots. But what I like to do, and have done previously, is quite straightforward. I'll just visit a big box store, like Home Depot or Lowe's, and pick up one of their food-grade 5-gallon buckets. Then, I'll simply drill some holes in the bottom and grow directly in that. If you intend to use your own buckets, just confirm that they are food-grade and that you always provide drainage holes, because you don't want water stagnating at the bottom of your bucket. That water will become anaerobic, start to smell unpleasant, and genuinely harm your plants. So if you do opt for your own containers, just ensure there's drainage at the bottom and that water can exit your pots. Another point is, if possible, you should always attempt to grow vertically any plants capable of vertical growth. So our typical plants that grow vertically include pole beans and peas. You can grow cucumbers vertically. They will climb. It will always be a significant advantage to grow upwards instead of outwards. It will make a massive difference. Let me provide an example. For instance, my tomatoes. I cultivate my tomatoes vertically. If I were to simply allow a tomato plant to sprawl across the ground, that plant would occupy approximately 3 to 4 feet when sprawling. But if we grow the tomato vertically, what I do is plant 10 tomatoes within 10 square feet, meaning my tomato plant occupies only 1 square foot instead of 4 square feet when grown vertically. And growing vertically offers numerous additional benefits, which we'll delve into more as we get into greater detail later in the video. But some of the appealing advantages include increased airflow, which aids in disease prevention, easier access for pruning your plants and performing maintenance on them, and even simpler harvesting when everything is at head height. Working in a garden configured like that is much more enjoyable. So tomatoes, cucumbers, peas, anything capable of vertical growth, I suggest you implement it. It will enable you to conserve space by growing upwards. There's an entirely different dimension of space you can tap into. So vertical cultivation makes a substantial difference. You must ensure you're not just looking downwards, you also need to look upwards. Now, let's delve into selecting what we actually wish to cultivate in our garden. The optimal starting point is for you to first determine your growing zone. For instance, myself, I reside in New Jersey. I'm situated in growing zone 7A. To ascertain your zone, simply go online and enter your zip code. It will provide your growing zone. What this accomplishes is informing you about what you can successfully grow within your specific climate. I'm in New Jersey. Crops that thrive exceptionally well for me include tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, lettuces, and various other things of that nature. That's where I recommend you begin. Start with items that will perform well in your particular climate during your initial year of gardening. What you should avoid is attempting to grow things that don't naturally thrive where you live. For example, it becomes quite cold here during winter, and we experience numerous hard frosts. So cultivating a citrus tree isn't really feasible for me. I would have to exert an immense amount of effort to grow a citrus tree. They simply don't grow naturally in this area. So, I'm not going to attempt cultivating citrus trees, avocado trees, and similar items because those thrive in zones with much warmer climates. Therefore, you don't want to go overboard trying to test the limits when you're first getting started. In the future, you can experiment with some different things. When you're just beginning, cultivate things that are likely to perform relatively well in your location. There will be a wide array of items you can grow, so you won't be restricted to just a handful of choices. Once you identify what grows in your location, then make sure you concentrate on planting things that you actually want to eat. I mean, it's only logical. If your family dislikes eating beets, then don't plant an abundance of beets. If you all adore tomatoes, plant some additional tomatoes. If you love cucumbers, plant plenty of cucumbers, watermelons, items like that. But just focus on cultivating things you intend to consume. That will sort of give you the best return for your effort, and it will simply make you more enthusiastic about getting out into the garden. Another factor to consider is growing some items that yield produce very quickly, and some that require a longer period to produce. For instance, if you have a backyard garden, you definitely need to grow tomatoes and peppers. Those require a lengthy time frame. You won't be getting tomatoes in under approximately 100 days or so. But what you should do is ensure you plant some radishes, some arugula, some lettuces, while awaiting those tomatoes to actually reach the harvesting stage. Something like a radish, which only takes about 4 weeks, around 28 days, you could plant a radish and obtain a harvest from it. So securing some of those early harvests from fast-maturing crops will help motivate and excite you to get out there and continue investing the effort needed to eventually harvest your tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, and various other items like that. Another aspect to take into account is also selecting some plant varieties to grow that possess disease resistance. For instance, regarding tomatoes, if you've never cultivated a garden before, you might assume a tomato is just a tomato. But there exists a vast array of different tomato varieties. There are thousands of varieties. So within those thousands of varieties, there are certain types of tomatoes or peppers or eggplants, whatever you're growing, that exhibit greater disease resistance than others. Therefore, if possible, it's wise to begin by cultivating some disease-resistant crop varieties that will be simpler to obtain a harvest from. For instance, if you visit Lowe's or Home Depot, some of the items they sell, some varieties like the Lemon Boy tomato or the Early Girl or the Juliet, these are disease-resistant types that will be relatively easy to harvest from. So, starting with those is beneficial. Once you acquire more knowledge, you can leverage the characteristics of specific plant varieties to your advantage. So, if you encounter an issue like where I live, we can face problems with late blight concerning tomatoes. There's a tomato variety named the cherry bomb tomato. It possesses incredible resistance to late blight. So if you plant that variety, you won't really need to be concerned about late blight becoming a problem because it's resistant to it. Therefore, cultivating some varieties with disease resistance will be helpful. In the future, you'll be able to identify which diseases are prevalent in your location simply through journaling. So ensure each year you're documenting everything that occurs. If you're experiencing issues with tomatoes, journal what those problems are. Then the following year, you can attempt to acquire some varieties resistant to those specific issues. This way, you kind of avoid having to deal with that problem. Another consideration, as we discussed earlier, you don't just want an annual perspective. You also want to think perennially. There are numerous different kinds of perennials available that I'm certain you would enjoy eating. So, you need to get them planted early as well. I suggest starting with perennials such as strawberries and raspberries. Those particular ones only require a few years to yield a harvest, and they will persist in returning every single year and producing for you. So you get some of your reliable annuals growing, your tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, and you also plant some of those perennials, your strawberries, raspberries, and each year you continue adding more, and before long you'll possess what I like to term a food forest, where you're encircled by various types of perennials and edible crops, and it almost becomes easier each year as you begin to layer those perennials. If feasible, I would also recommend planting some fruit trees, perhaps an apple tree or a peach tree. The old saying goes, the optimal time to plant a fruit tree was 7 years ago. The second best time is today. So getting some fruit trees planted early would be advisable. Another thing will be flowers. So sounds like we got a plane flying overhead. That's okay though. So when it comes to growing a garden, even if you're just growing it for the edibles, it's a good idea to make sure you plant lots of flowers in your garden. They're only going to help. They'll bring in a lot of beneficial insects, a lot of pollinators, and it will also create just a more beautiful garden for you. So always make sure you're getting some flowers there too, and focus on things that you want to eat. As we move further into this video, I'll explain in detail some more about choosing crops, choosing plants, but this is just to give you kind of like an overview so you could start working on what you're going to actually order and what you're going to be growing in your new garden. We got into choosing a location and then selecting a size of your garden and then selecting some veggies. Now let's move into actually planning how and where you're going to plant what you're growing. When it comes to planting and getting your garden going, I like to think about it like a contractor or a builder or just someone who's going to build a house. So when they go to build a house, or anybody, if you're going to build a house, you don't just go, I want a room, I want a bedroom, and I want a bathroom, and, maybe a living room. What you do is you have all the plans designed for a house. And technically, the house is finished before you even start it. So that's the most ideal way to go. Another appealing aspect of wood chips is that if you acquire arborist wood chips, they attract worms because they contain leaves and needles. The worms will arrive and consume many of those materials, thus introducing those beneficial organisms. Furthermore, fungi will break down the wood chips over time, which will bring the fungi in to decompose the wood chips. Some thoughts you might have regarding wood chips. No, they will not deplete your soil of nitrogen because we are only layering the wood chips atop the soil. If you incorporated the wood chips into the soil, then they would deplete nitrogen, but we are merely laying the wood chips down as a thick ground cover. Another point is that wood chips will not attract termites. Termites favor dry wood. When wood chips rest on the ground, they retain moisture. Just picking them up reveals they are damp, so they won't attract termites. You needn't worry about that. Instead, they will attract creatures like worms and others, which I find somewhat more advantageous. Alternatively, if you believe your weeds are simply overwhelming, you could solarize a section during the summer. You could take a clear plastic tarp, place it over an area for approximately 3 to 6 months, and that will effectively burn out all the weeds, killing them down to the roots. So, it's a viable option. The only drawback is it will take about a year or so to accomplish, so I don't consider it the most ideal choice for preparing your location. If you don't wish to physically pull the weeds when they emerge through the wood chips, you could simply take some wood chips, and once a weed appears, step on it with your foot and cover it with even more wood chips. If the plant lacks access to light, it simply won't grow. That's essentially how it works. One crucial thing to consider if using wood chips in the garden is that wood chips function as a mulch. They are not a growing substrate. Wood chips are ideal for your garden area if you intend to plant into the ground. In that case, you can pull the wood chips back, and once you reach the soil level, plant your items into the soil, then bring the wood chips back around as a mulch. However, you do not want to plant directly into the wood chips. Regardless of whether you're planting in-ground or not, I still recommend applying wood chips to your entire garden. That's my practice because then you won't have to worry about weeds around any of your beds either. So it results in a neater looking area, easier upkeep, and it's simply the preferred method. When preparing any section, wood chips are typically free. You can usually obtain them locally from various sources, and they are something that will enhance your soil over time while also suppressing weeds. It's time to delve into constructing and preparing our raised beds for receiving our plants. We're starting to really get into some of the substantial aspects so we can move closer to the actual planting phase and then bring ourselves even nearer to the ultimate objective of gathering that harvest, which is what we all aim to do. I favor growing in raised beds for a multitude of reasons. The first is the enhanced soil quality. When you create your own soil or acquire quality bagged soil, it will simply possess better quality than your native soil. The consistency will be superior, you'll have better nourishment, and overall, it will be more conducive for root growth. So it's just a good option, particularly when starting out. Another factor is that drainage will be superior in those raised beds because the structure of your soil is better. Consequently, it will drain more effectively. You won't experience any saturation, and subsequently, you won't have waterlogged soil that becomes anaerobic and negatively impacts your plants, causing root rot. So overall, you'll achieve better drainage with a raised bed as well, partly because the soil quality is also better. Furthermore, the soil within your raised beds will actually warm up more quickly in the spring, which is advantageous because it's elevated off the ground. The beds will capture some of that solar heat, permitting you to plant in those beds earlier than you could in the ground. So it helps you somewhat extend your season on the front end, which is nice. Another aspect is weeding. There will be fewer weeds in your raised bed, especially when you construct your own soil and add your own potting or garden soil from a bag, as those typically don't contain weed seeds. So you won't have to contend with weeds nearly as much. Also, once your bed is planted, you'll be applying mulch and other materials, which will also help prevent weeds. So weeding in general will simply be much more pleasant overall. Additionally, your soil won't become as compressed because we won't be walking on these beds. We'll just be able to reach directly into them. When you walk on soil, it compresses it, reducing the air content by breaking down the soil structure and making it more difficult for roots to navigate through that soil. So, when we grow in raised beds, we'll experience less compaction overall. These raised beds are much easier to maintain when they are at a comfortable height. This particular raised bed is slightly lower, but some of the raised beds I possess are 32 inches tall, so you don't need to get down on your hands and knees to work in them. It's very accessible, very easy to work in. It makes the entire process simply more enjoyable. So overall, I believe it's just going to be significantly better. Another advantage is that it will simplify dealing with pests. For me, in this area, I step out the front door in the spring and summer, and there are usually 2 or 3 rabbits just lounging in the front yard. So, when you have somewhat tall raised beds, the rabbits cannot access the bed because they're just slightly too high up. Thus, it will help mitigate some of your animal pest issues. Furthermore, my raised beds, I construct covers for them, and even for my Lego raised beds, they offer cover systems where we can place insect netting or just a cover over the top of the bed. This prevents pests, birds, squirrels, and similar creatures from reaching our crops. So protecting your plants is simpler when they're contained within beds, and it just makes things much easier. It seems paradoxical, but this is the reality. I mentioned how the beds drain better when growing in a raised bed with self-made soil. Yet they actually hold moisture better too, owing to that organic matter. It possesses the ability to either retain moisture or release it as needed. So not only will your raised bed drain more effectively, but it will also retain water better. The type of raised bed you choose to grow in is your decision. I prefer opting for metal raised beds because I consider them a one-and-done solution. You install the metal raised bed once, and you'll never need to install another. You'll be able to grow in it indefinitely. Alternatively, if desired, you could construct your own raised beds using wood. I've done this with practically every type of wood. Cedar wood is the longest-lasting option, but it's quite costly, making it difficult to build numerous cedar beds. They become very expensive at that point. The metal beds are either less expensive or similarly priced. You could also use common building lumber. I've employed that for many of my beds in the past. The only issue with using common building lumber is that it won't be pressure treated, so you'll typically only get about 4 or 5 years of service from that bed. I usually push it and get about 5 years of use from my wooden beds, but you'll just have to rebuild it again in the future if that's something you're willing to do. That choice is yours. I would not utilize pressure-treated wood for my raised beds, particularly for cultivating food items. Some individuals might argue, oh, they no longer use the creosote and chemicals previously found in pressure-treated wood. Well, I refuse to grow any food I intend to consume, food that should be organic, healthy, the best in the world if done correctly, in pressure-treated wood. I don't recommend you guys do either. So when it comes down to it, the material you select is up to you. I suggest choosing metal raised beds. They are my preferred type to grow in. The metal ones are the ones I opt to use. However, if you possess some skills, you could build your own bed. Another possibility is, I have constructed many beds using recycled materials. For instance, I'll go to, drive past Lowe's or Home Depot that have discarded pallets outside. I'll collect some of those pallets and then use them to build my own raised bed. Similar to common building lumber, they will only last perhaps 4 or 5 years, and it will require more skills, time, and effort, but it will be cheaper. So, whichever option you choose, that's your decision. Another appealing feature of raised beds is the ability to proactively protect your bed from certain animal pests. For example, if you have gophers or similar creatures emerging from beneath your bed, you could lay hardware cloth underneath it. This way, nothing can really burrow up from underneath your bed. One final point I wish to mention regarding raised beds, which I touched upon briefly earlier, relates to ensuring adequate spacing between the beds, at least about 2 feet. You don't want them positioned extremely close together. One reason for this is that when you grow in these beds, the plants won't be confined solely to this area. So I might grow things like cucumbers, perhaps, and train them out the side, trellising them along the side, and then let them grow into the pathway. The same applies to cantaloupes, cucumbers, and some of your other plants. Even your eggplants and such might hang slightly over the side. So you can derive a lot of utility from the space within that raised bed. Just ensure you provide a slight gap between the beds. That will make it easier for you to move around in there. So raised beds are the way to go. Consider these factors when installing your own beds. There's one additional detail I neglected to mention about we've covered building and prepping the bed. Now let's discuss filling our bed so we can actually get some items planted. The first principle regarding your raised beds is do not fill your bed with native soil. The native soil will be overly dense and simply unsuitable for your raised beds. Although you might think this approach makes it free and cheap, it won't be worth your time and effort. You might save some money, but you'll likely waste your time, probably fail to get a harvest, and end up feeling discouraged. So I wouldn't recommend using native soil, as I mentioned briefly earlier. You could construct your own soil, or you could utilize some bagged soil. So if you wish to build your own soil, a very basic recipe you can begin with includes some cocoa coir or peat moss, then some vermiculite, some perlite, and some compost. Combining these elements will provide you with a decent soil mixture. The specific ratios are something you would need to experiment with slightly, but in my video dedicated to soil making, I delve into detail about those aspects. Bagged soil is also a great option. Again, just ensure you obtain a quality bagged soil product. However, the thing you want to avoid is making your own soil or acquiring bagged soil and then attempting to fill an entire tall raised bed like a 32-inch one completely with good soil. That would simply be a waste of time and most certainly a waste of money. Our plants, the annuals we'll be cultivating in these beds, and some of the perennials only require approximately 12 to 14 inches of quality soil. So, if you possess a 32-inch bed, you do want to add something at the bottom to occupy that space, something that will also serve as organic matter. This leads into a gardening style known as Culture, where you bury logs and other organic material like sticks, then place the soil on top. As the season progresses and it rains, those logs absorb water, becoming almost like water reservoirs that, during summer and hot periods, can actually wick moisture upwards into your soil. So not only are you utilizing the logs to conserve space, save on soil, and save money, but you're also gaining beneficial effects from them. I've excavated logs from a bed that I buried about 3 years prior, and within those logs, I could observe plant roots growing into them to access moisture when needed. Thus, logs are a viable option to place in your beds beneath the soil, but you would need them to be rotted logs. Those are the ones capable of absorbing moisture more readily. Finding rotted logs can sometimes be challenging, especially if you reside in a suburban area. Additionally, transporting the logs, lifting them, and filling the bottom of the bed with them can be somewhat strenuous and slightly inconvenient. A good alternative to that would be simply using composted wood chips at the base of your bed. That's my newer method, which I've been employing for a year or two now, and it has performed exceptionally well, and it's what I intend to do more of in the future. So, you don't want to use fresh wood chips like those used for mulch. We discussed earlier that for mulch, you want to use arborist wood chips, freshly cut trees containing needles, leaves, and all associated materials. But when filling the base of your bed, you absolutely do not want to use arborist wood chips because those will begin to compost and generate heat, subsequently starting to decompose. You don't want that occurring beneath your soil. You should use wood chips that have been sitting for about a year, have already composted, and are at the stage where they're somewhat more porous and fungi are infiltrating them. Those are the types of wood chips suitable for filling the base of your bed, and that approach is likely to yield the most success. After your bed is filled with your chosen filler material at the bottom and your quality soil in the top 12 inches above that, then you should start considering fertilizers. So, if you create your own soil, as I do, my compost source is mushroom compost. It has already been utilized for growing mushrooms, so it's nutritionally depleted. Therefore, I need to ensure I'm adding nutrients back into it. I recommend adding an all-purpose fertilizer even before planting your items. So it's March currently. This would be an opportune time to visit your beds and apply a layer of fertilizer over the top, then incorporate that into the top few inches of soil. This way, each time you water, the fertilizer will leach down into the soil and help nourish the plants. I prefer using my own personal fertilizer, my JP Secret Stuff fertilizer. It's an entirely organic, natural fertilizer. You don't have to use that specific one, but ensure you choose an all-organic natural fertilizer. You want to avoid using synthetic fertilizers. Synthetic fertilizers can potentially burn your plants, but they will also eliminate some of the beneficial microbes in the soil and could potentially increase soil salinity too. So, while they might be cheaper and seem easier, in the long run, synthetic fertilizers will likely cause more harm than good in my view. Therefore, I strongly suggest opting for a natural fertilizer. After your plants are growing and thriving in the raised bed, it's important to go around and ensure you apply mulch around your plants before the warm weather arrives. Mulch provides several benefits. It will conserve moisture. It will also maintain the soil temperature relatively consistently, preventing excessive heating, which is better for plant root growth. Roots thrive when the soil temperature is relatively stable, remaining cool even on hot days. You don't want to leave your soil exposed, allowing it to heat up from the sun. Black soil absorbs heat, become overly warm, and consequently stress your plant's roots, which then stresses the plants overall. So, you want to apply mulch around them to help conserve moisture, maintain consistent and cool soil temperatures, and also help suppress weeds. There are several mulches I would recommend, all being organic and natural. If you can obtain straw locally, that's a good choice. Ensure you don't acquire hay, as hay contains seeds, so avoid using that. Alternatively, you could use something like a wood chip mulch. I don't favor wood chips for my annual plants. The other option would be something like a shredded leaf mulch. You can simply collect leaves locally. That's my practice in the fall. I go around. People place all their bags of leaves outside their homes. In the fall, I collect all those leaves, store them in the backyard, and then come spring, I take my lawnmower, run it over the leaves to shred them into smaller pieces, and then use that as mulch. You don't want to use whole leaves as mulch because they can form a mat over the soil, potentially reducing water penetration and hindering soil respiration. But if you shred the leaves, they become a perfect mulch for your young plants. As I mentioned, you could use wood chips, but concerning wood chips, I prefer applying them around woody species and perennials. It seems that woody species favor a woodier mulch, possibly due to something Jeff Lawton discussed in the past. This insight helped me understand it. It's like woody species, such as trees, prefer a woodier mulch because it's more dominated by fungi. They favor a fungal-dominated mulch, which is characteristic of woody species. Wood chips attract fungi. The fungi arrive and assist in breaking them down. So, that type of mulch appears to perform better for woody species and perennials. Regarding your annuals, for items like cucumbers, lettuces, even some of your brassicas, it seems that a compost mulch or a leaf mulch works better. Essentially, a bacteria-dominated mulch performs better for annuals and herbaceous plants, whereas woody plants prefer more of a woody mulch. So that's my preferred approach. My favorite mulch ultimately ends up being the shredded leaf mulch. It's readily available, easy to use, and I genuinely prefer utilizing it. Another point to consider is once your plants begin performing exceptionally well and appear to be entering the production stage, let's consider your tomatoes, for example, Your tomatoes are growing vigorously, look healthy, and suddenly you start noticing flowers appearing and small tomatoes beginning to form. You want to ensure you go by and apply a top dressing of fertilizer because they utilized much of the nutrition present in the soil to reach that growth stage. They will require even more nutrition to create the fruit, develop it, and bring it to maturity. So you want to make sure you go around and apply a generous top dressing once your plants start heading into that productive phase. The same principle applies even to plants like cabbages and cauliflowers. Once they begin showing signs of starting to form the head, I'll go around and ensure I provide them with a top dressing of an all-purpose fertilizer. I'll simply pull the mulch back, add some fertilizer onto the soil surface, then mix that into the top few inches, and subsequently water the entire area thoroughly. This ensures your plants have sufficient resources heading into the productive stage. As the season begins to wind down and you're approaching fall and winter, if possible, you should continue growing items in the beds. But if not, and you don't intend to cultivate any vegetables, you could plant some cover crops to provide benefits over the winter, just so the soil isn't left bare and exposed. Or, if you prefer not to do that, you could simply add a nice mulch, like a leaf mulch. That's what I did back here. We just added a layer of leaves to this garden bed. The reason for doing this is it helps protect the soil, insulate it, prevent weeds from growing, and it also aids the microbiological life, and all the beneficial bacteria significantly if we can prevent the bed from freezing excessively and maintain a consistent soil temperature. Many of those beneficial organisms can multiply in there. So even if you're not actively growing in your bed, ensure you at least have it mulched and covered throughout the winter. Now, I need to offer a little, so before I place items in the ground, I ensure I have a solid fence installed. Some common pests in my area include rabbits, and to a lesser extent, deer and groundhogs. What I prefer to do is use a standard welded wire fence, like a 6-foot fence. Then I take chicken wire, dig down about a foot adjacent to that fence, and bury the chicken wire at least a foot or two deep at the base. This ensures the chicken wire extends high enough that rabbits cannot slip through the welded wire fence, but it also goes deep enough to deter groundhogs when they attempt to burrow deep down and underneath. So essentially, depending on where you live and the specific animal pests you encounter, you must design your protection measures accordingly. Then you simply need to consider it before even contemplating planting necessarily, because they are bound to arrive. You could invest all the effort into planting things, getting them established, and growing well, only to come out one day and find them completely devastated by an animal or something similar. So you definitely do not want that to occur. Ensure you prioritize protection even before necessarily thinking about planting. If you contend with deer or similar animals, you'll require a fence at least 8 feet tall, and even then, they can sometimes jump over it. So it's going to be an ongoing consideration. Some pests, like squirrels and such, still give me trouble occasionally. It's challenging for me to keep them out of the backyard sometimes. I sometimes wonder if I have a squirrel problem or perhaps just a deficiency of cats. But regardless, squirrels frequently target many of my crops. I recall growing perfect peanuts. They were just about ready for harvesting. I planned to come out the next day to harvest them. I was boasting about them. Then I came out, and suddenly all the peanuts were gone. A squirrel had taken every single one. So don't let that happen to you. Ensure you're genuinely thinking about protection when embarking on starting your garden. Let's transition over to discussing seeds. If you prefer, you could start your own plants from seeds, but if it's your first year and you feel it might be slightly excessive and potentially daunting, you could simply purchase some starts from a local big box store or a nearby garden nursery right around the optimal planting time. However, even if you opt for that route, I still recommend perhaps trying to start some of your own seeds at home. Since you'll be visiting local sources for plants anyway, it doesn't hurt to try your hand at starting them. This way, you can cultivate your own seeds in the future, as doing so offers numerous advantages. Just for a brief basic overview regarding ordering or acquiring seeds. Some of your heirloom varieties typically possess superior taste and flavor, and potentially even better appearance sometimes, because these are varieties that have been passed down over extended periods. The characteristic of heirloom varieties is they usually thrive well in a specific region or set of circumstances. That's often where they originated. That's where they perform best. Consequently, they tend to be varieties that are sometimes slightly more challenging to grow, particularly for beginners, even though they might offer advantages like better flavor, color, and similar traits. Regarding your hybrid varieties, these are essentially heirlooms, or open-pollinated plants that have been crossed with other plants for disease resistance, achieve larger harvests, or even combat pests or other issues. Thus, many of your hybrid types will often prove easier to cultivate. For instance, if you intend to grow tomatoes or similar crops, there are some varieties I would strongly suggest growing as hybrids, which will almost certainly guarantee harvests, and they are also delicious and genuinely excellent overall. So something like the Super Sweet 100, it's my all-time favorite tomato. It tastes incredible, grows prolifically, doesn't suffer significantly from disease or pest problems, and simply makes the entire growing experience much simpler while also tasting amazing. There are others like Lemon Boy, which is a good one, Mountain Magic, and earlier I mentioned the Cherry Bomb tomato, possessing excellent disease resistance to late blight. So there exists a wide array of different hybrid seed types you could order that will simply facilitate the whole growing process for you considerably. I recommend always incorporating some hybrids into your garden, types you know will yield a harvest and form the foundation of your yield. Then, experiment with some interesting heirlooms just for enjoyment, things that will excite you about getting out into the garden. Those will serve as bonus additions. Just ensure that, in my view, you don't become overly dogmatic saying, "I only grow heirlooms, that's my sole practice." It confines you unnecessarily, and to me, it diminishes some of the enjoyment. Concerning storing your seeds, if you order packets of seeds and don't utilize them all, or just generally, ensure you store them in a dry, cool location. Doing so will significantly extend their lifespan compared to letting them get damp or leaving them in a spot that becomes very hot. Regarding your seeds, some remain viable for longer durations than others. For instance, tomatoes. Their seeds will remain viable and achieve fairly good germination for up to approximately 7 years. So, if you don't plant them the first, second, or third year, you can still use those seeds later on. However, for some crops like spinach, your spinach seeds will realistically only be suitable for planting for about 1 year, perhaps 2. After the first year, the germination rate of spinach drops considerably. So if you experience poor germination due to old seeds, it just complicates matters slightly. Therefore, just be aware of the viability and lifespan of seeds, and you'll be fine. If you wish to order a large quantity of tomatoes, you have ample time to plant them. Another often overlooked aspect is ensuring you order your seeds from a reliable, reputable company. Some companies might sell old seeds that don't germinate well, leaving you wondering, did I do something incorrectly? But ultimately, they might just be selling older seeds with low germination rates. What I do over at my website is partner with M.I. Gardener. He's a friend and fellow YouTuber. He sells seeds for $2 per pack, and he does an excellent job ensuring seeds don't remain on the shelves for extended periods and move quickly. This guarantees the seeds are fresh, resulting in really high germination rates. The other thing to be cautious of is the gimmicky items you might encounter on platforms like eBay, where people sell things like blue tomatoes. If it's not from a reputable company, I would be skeptical. It doesn't mean you shouldn't try it. Just be wary of individuals potentially trying to deceive you for extra profit. Something I'll touch upon again later, but it's crucial to mention now, is when planting items, if you intend to do as I do and cultivate numerous different varieties, just ensure you label everything you plant, because you'll eventually have something ready to harvest and you'll think, what on earth is this? Then you'll have to refer back to your orders and match it with pictures. It just becomes somewhat inconvenient. So just make sure you label your items and your seedlings when you're actually planting things. Regarding certain seeds like peas and even beans and similar items, some seeds actually benefit from being soaked for about 24 hours prior to planting. The same applies to parsley, so just investigate the specific requirements when starting seeds and germinating them. Different seeds prefer different temperatures, which we'll discuss further as well. So overall, just ensure you have a solid understanding of what you're planting, how to plant it, and consequently achieve good germination and success, rather than ending up frustrated by the process. We've covered seeds. Now let's discuss starting your seeds indoors. That's my preferred method for starting my plants, initiating things inside. When you start your own seeds, it's simply far superior, in my opinion, than purchasing plants from the big box store. Because when you acquire them from the big box store, you are subject to the varieties they offer and also the condition of the plants they have. So, if they lack the varieties you desire, that's your only option. If their plants don't appear healthy or look stressed, say for instance, their peppers are flowering, which indicates stress while still in the small flats, then that's all you have to work with. But when you start your own seeds at home, you can cultivate exceptionally healthy plants whenever you choose, achieve perfect timing, and grow an incredible diversity of varieties. So, it's definitely worth the additional time and effort, in my view. As gardeners, one of our greatest opportunities is the ability to start and grow the thousands upon thousands of different varieties of essentially every type of plant available. So, it's truly enjoyable. The first thing you'll need to ascertain when starting your seeds indoors is essentially the timing, when you should start them. To determine this, go online, enter your last expected frost date along with your zip code if you reside in an area that experiences frost like I do. This information will tell you your last expected frost date. Then, when you want to start something like tomatoes, you can simply look up the recommended timing. For tomatoes, it's suggested to start them approximately 6 to 8 weeks prior to your last expected frost. So, now that we have our last expected frost date, it serves as a guidepost, informing us, relative to that date, when to initiate starting all our different seed types. Thus, it becomes relevant to your specific location. However, when it comes down to it, I always maintain that starting things slightly later is preferable to starting them too early. Just as an illustration here, my last expected frost date is anticipated around April 30th. I won't plant my... As I mentioned though, you could just acquire plants from the big box store if you prefer, from Lowe's, Home Depot, whatever. It's a viable option. When starting your seeds inside, timing is the first consideration. Next is lighting. You must ensure you have a sufficient amount of light. Just as we discussed earlier regarding gardens in general, you need about 6 to 8 hours of quality light for your young seedlings. Attempting to place a plant on a south-facing windowsill will likely not yield great success. I mean, it might work depending on your location, but you could easily encounter 2 or 3 consecutive cloudy days, causing your seedlings to become excessively tall and spindly, failing to grow well. I prefer utilizing grow lights because then you can control the duration of light exposure for the plants, granting you more control and eliminating dependency on the sun's position. You could employ either an LED light or a fluorescent light. The choice between them is up to you. The fluorescent light will be slightly less expensive, emit some heat, and still facilitate relatively good plant growth. The LED light will be somewhat more costly and generate less heat. Both are effective options. I've used both. I continue to use both. So the type of light you employ is really your decision, unless you possess ample space in a greenhouse or similar structure, but you will likely require a light source. The next item you'll need is some seed cells, or a method for starting your seeds. You can opt for a budget-friendly approach using egg cartons, or you can acquire quality seed starting bundles, cells, and related items. I use the Bigo ones. They are my favorite. Next, you're going to need a heat mat. Regarding different plant types, their seeds prefer to germinate under varying conditions. Essentially, all plants require some water for germination, and some need light and air. But temperature is the factor that truly influences the speed and success of germination. For instance, if you attempt to start tomato seeds and the soil temperature is below 55 degrees, then your tomatoes or peppers might never sprout. Conversely, if the soil temperature ranges between approximately 80 to 95 degrees, then your tomatoes or peppers might only require about a week to sprout. Thus, temperature is critically important. This applies to your warm season crops, your tomatoes, peppers, eggplants. They prefer warmer soil for germination. Therefore, to elevate the soil temperature, you might need to utilize a heat mat simply to induce those seeds to germinate and sprout. The same principle applies in reverse concerning your cooler season crops. So a crop like arugula might fail to sprout if the soil temperature exceeds 75 degrees Celsius. Because it's a cooler season crop, it prefers cooler soil temperatures for sprouting. When we consider this, it makes perfect sense. Imagine a tomato seed naturally falling to the ground. It wouldn't be logical for the tomato to sprout when the soil temperature is 40 degrees Celsius, because the young seedling would subsequently perish. So, naturally, those tomatoes sprout when the soil temperature warms up and outdoor conditions are warm. The same holds true for arugula. Arugula will sprout when conditions are cool and the soil temperature is cool because it thrives in cool environments. But once the summer heat arrives and it's genuinely warm outside with warm soil, the arugula won't sprout, because if it did, it would immediately bolt, go to seed, due to the excessive heat for its growth. So, we just need to be mindful of temperature, and a heat mat will resolve many of your issues related to seed sprouting. It might seem like a minor detail, but it definitely makes a significant difference. When I plant my seeds, I usually drop a few seeds into each cell just to ensure I'm not wasting time and that some seeds sprout. After that occurs, you might have 3 or 4 young seedlings within one small cell. You could either separate those and then transplant them once they develop 2 true leaves, or you could simply thin them. I typically prefer just thinning the seedlings. I plant more than necessary. This allows me to thin some out and select the best ones, rather than planting just enough and being somewhat constrained by whatever emerges. I prefer having the ability to be more selective and choose the plants I wish to cultivate. Another point when starting your own seeds in those cells is you absolutely do not want your plants to become root-bound. Once your plants in the cells possess 2 true leaves, which differ from the initial seed casing leaves, cotyledons, once they have 2 true leaves, technically, in the smaller cells, you could transplant them into a larger pot. What you must avoid is allowing your seedling to remain in a cell, become root-bound, get stressed, as that will just lead to a multitude of problems, slow down growth, and could potentially even impact your future yield, especially concerning plants like tomatoes and peppers. So, ensuring your plants don't become root-bound and investing the time to transplant them into larger pots if necessary will contribute to your overall harvest success. Additionally, after your seedlings have sprouted from their cells and are still contained within them, I recommend watering from the bottom. This is consistently a superior method of watering. If we water from the top, sometimes that water merely sits on the surface and drains through without being effectively absorbed by the soil. Then we're left with primarily surface roots developing near the top because that's the only soil zone with high moisture content. Conversely, when we water from the bottom, it encourages the roots to grow downwards towards the water source, and the water can then be wicked upwards into the soil. This represents a better, more efficient watering technique. It will help mitigate issues like damping off, a condition where seedlings can die. So, if feasible, bottom watering is something I suggest implementing. Another recommendation is introducing a light fan into your grow room, particularly when your seedlings are young. We desire our seedlings to be short, stout, and strong. We want to avoid them becoming tall, weak, and spindly. To help strengthen our seedlings, assuming we've provided sufficient light to keep them compact, and as long as the grow room temperatures remain within a healthy range, say between 60 and 72 degrees, then the temperature aspect should be fine. We just need something that will somewhat simulate the natural wind outdoors. This enables the plants to develop strength and resilience to handle a bit of breeze. So, a gentle fan blowing across your young seedlings will help considerably. You don't want an excessively strong wind blasting them, causing stress or wind damage, but just a light fan makes a substantial difference. Then, probably the most frequently overlooked task that novice gardeners forget, leading to significant problems and considerable disappointment when it happens, is failing to harden off seedlings before transplanting them into the garden. So you invest all the time cultivating these plants in your grow room, under grow lights, or perhaps even in your greenhouse. If you take those plants and immediately transplant them into the garden, they will experience severe stress, and there's a high probability they will simply perish. Generally, the reason is that you established a favorable, ideal growing environment indoors. Now you're introducing them to a natural environment. It's simply too drastic a transition for them. Therefore, what you need to do is gradually acclimate your plants to outdoor conditions over a period of approximately 1 week. This process is known as hardening off. So we take our plants from the grow room. Perhaps on the first day, we bring them outside to a shaded location for about 2 hours, then return them inside. The following day, we bring them outside for 3 hours in a shaded spot, maybe 4 hours, then bring them back indoors. Then, around the third day, we move them to a location for 5 hours that receives filtered sunlight, and where the wind isn't excessive, then bring them inside. We repeat this process over a week until we're confident that the plant can spend a full 24 hours outdoors without showing any signs of stress, such as wilting or drooping. After our plants can endure a complete 24 hours outside, then we can transplant them into the garden. So the transition becomes almost from being outdoors in a pot to being placed in the ground, rather than moving from living inside in a pot directly into the ground. So hardening off. It's something people dislike doing because it requires time and can be slightly inconvenient, but it's an essential step if you aim for a successful garden. We've covered starting some seeds indoors. Let's shift focus to direct sowing some seeds and also discuss transplanting a bit further. Regarding certain crops and seeds, they actually dislike being transplanted. For instance, your root crops like carrots, beets, radishes, these items do not respond well to being started indoors and then moved into the ground. They possess such a long taproot, they simply don't perform as well. There are other plants too that aren't worth the effort of starting inside because they just don't tolerate transplanting well, such as beans, green beans, and similar types, and even peas. They simply prefer being started in the location where they will ultimately grow. Even something like spinach, with its long taproot, prefers to be directly sown. It's not worthwhile starting it inside and transplanting it out. That's essentially what I've discovered. If you did start your seeds inside and successfully hardened them off, you must ensure you harden your seedlings before bringing them outside for transplanting into the ground. Assuming you did harden them off and they are ready for transplanting before proceeding, there are a few factors we want to consider. The first is ensuring these plants are watered before transplanting, that they possess some moisture. We don't want them to be completely dry, as this will simply be stressful for the plant when transitioning to its new environment. So, we want to confirm they have an adequate moisture level before transplanting. Then, after transplanting them into the garden, we want to ensure we water them in again. Watering the plants in helps settle the soil around the roots, ensuring good root-to-soil contact and sufficient moisture for healthy growth as they adjust to their new home. Concerning the timing of transplanting, you'll want to refer back to your last expected frost date. You'll also want to check the weather forecast. For example, suppose you have cabbage or something similar you wish to transplant into the garden. What you should avoid is going out on a day when it's 75 or 80 degrees, intensely sunny, the sun is blazing, and then transplanting your cabbage into the ground midday. It will simply be excessively stressful for it. The optimal days for transplanting are overcast days or days with a light mist. This way, as your plant moves into its new home, it isn't immediately subjected to intense sun. It can spend time adjusting to its new surroundings before attempting to enter a major growth phase. Alternatively, if you cannot find a cloudy day when you intend to transplant, my preferred approach is to ensure the subsequent night isn't expected to get too cold. Then, I'll simply transplant as the sun is setting. This allows the plant time before sunrise the next day to acclimate to its new location. I just find that it performs better under those conditions. There are a few tips and tricks related to transplanting. Whenever I transplant crops that aren't brassicas like cabbages, flowers, broccoli, if I'm transplanting peppers, tomatoes, or eggplant, I make sure to sprinkle some mycorrhizal fungi on the base of my plants, directly onto the roots. This action establishes the mycorrhizal association. This aids in mitigating transplant shock. It assists the plants in absorbing water and also nutrients. So it's an excellent addition, and it's quite easy to implement right when you're transplanting. Another aspect we should consider is spacing for our plants. That's another reason I recommended utilizing a square foot method for gardening. It determines all the spacing requirements for you because we don't want our plants to be excessively crowded. Our plants can essentially only grow as large as the space we allocate to them. So if we desire large plants, they require sufficient space for that growth. But we also want to avoid giving plants too much space, resulting in large gaps between our plantings, as that simply wastes valuable space. After getting our items transplanted and watered in, it's also advisable to apply mulch immediately. This mulch will help maintain a consistent soil temperature, as we've discussed. It will also aid in reducing weeds and will be highly beneficial in numerous ways. So it's good practice, after planting and watering, to go by and simply mulch everything. Additionally, some of our plants, like peppers and even some tomatoes, benefit from being staked early rather than late when they first start growing. Basically, if you have something like a pepper plant growing, a bell pepper, that plant will become heavy, and then the weight of the fruit will begin to pull the plant downwards. So it's best to insert the stake right when you plant. This way, you avoid disturbing the roots when you actually push the stake into the ground. If you wait until the pepper plants clearly require staking, you'll have to push a stake through the ground, inevitably damaging the plant's roots. So, it's another good practice for plants requiring staking to ensure you add the stake while actually planting them. Regarding transplanting, most of your plants should be transplanted at the same depth they were situated in the pot from which you removed them. However, some plants actually prefer and can tolerate being buried deeper, such as your tomatoes. Tomatoes will actually develop roots along the stem. So when planting your tomatoes, you want to bury those tomatoes up to the first set of leaves or potentially even higher. This encourages the growth of additional roots from those plants. But for the majority of other plants, just plant them at approximately the same depth as the pot they came out of. Now let's discuss proper watering practices in the garden. This is actually more significant and a bigger deal than you might initially think. You could potentially be damaging or harming your plants, introducing more disease, simply by not watering correctly. When it comes to watering in the garden, providing a deep watering less frequently is preferable to being out there daily performing surface watering. When you consistently surface water and neglect deep soaking waterings, your roots will tend to remain closer to the soil surface because that's what they become accustomed to, instead of growing downwards in search of water and expanding to find their own water sources. Even concerning watering, appropriate timing is important. If you're going to water your garden, it's always best to do so in the morning before the intense sun arrives. If it's already midday, 90 degrees, hot, and your plants are wilting, you could go out and water them, but that won't benefit your plants nearly as much as if you had gone out in the morning and watered them before the heat set in, or even watered them at night. This allows them to absorb the moisture throughout the night, making them better prepared when the heat arrives. That's another reason why mulch is so crucial. When we mulch our garden, the soil will stay moist for a longer duration and won't dry out rapidly. Basically, if I water my garden without any mulch down on a hot day, then not only will the roots absorb some water, but the sun will also beat down on the soil, causing evaporation, and the soil will dry out much faster. In contrast, if we have mulch down, the soil won't receive direct sunlight. You'll experience almost no evaporation, and water loss will primarily be due to plant uptake. Then, when you water again the next time, the soil won't be excessively dry. For some of our plants, like tomatoes, issues such as blossom end rot sometimes arise. We often assume blossom end rot stems from insufficient calcium, prompting us to add lots of Epsom salt. But in reality, blossom end rot frequently occurs due to inconsistent watering. It happens when you water your plant, and then the soil completely dries out because there's no mulch, and then it remains completely dry until you return and water it again. This fluctuation in moisture is simply too drastic a change and shift for the plant to handle. When we have mulch down, it allows the water level to remain consistent, the ground stays consistently moist, and it ultimately results in less stress on the plants. If possible, the most efficient watering method is a drip irrigation system because that water goes directly to the soil, allowing it to soak in effectively, and it's simply easy and efficient. However, setting it up can require some effort. I don't utilize a drip irrigation system, I just go by and manually water the plants. There's one practice I avoid though, and I suggest you avoid it as well: overhead watering. Overhead watering typically only introduces problems most of the time. When cultivating plants like tomatoes and peppers, fungal issues often become significant problems, especially with tomatoes. When we water our plants and wet the leaves through overhead watering, those leaves have a higher likelihood of developing fungal issues and spreading them, as moisture facilitates fungal growth. So it's always more efficient and preferable to water your plants at their base. Do not engage in overhead watering. It will likely only cause problems for most of your plants. I just get down there and water by hand. It takes some time, but I enjoy watering by hand because it allows me to spend more time in the garden. That's when I notice if something is ailing or if a pest is present, because I'm getting very close to those plants, spending time around them, and I believe it ultimately proves advantageous. Regarding items like your container garden and growing plants in containers, those will dry out more quickly than plants in the ground simply because they lack the large volume of the ground to retain moisture. People frequently ask me, how often should I water my containers? That depends on numerous different factors. One is the effectiveness of your drainage, and also the size of the plant, how much water it's absorbing, and how rapidly it's utilizing that water and transpiring it through its leaves. The best method I use for checking container plants is, I'll water the plant, ensure it's saturated, then lift it to check the weight. I'll register that weight mentally and note, okay, that's how it feels. Then the next day, I'll come out and check the weight again. Once the plant feels considerably lighter than it did previously, then I'll go by and water that plant again. I won't simply adhere to a schedule like, I water my plants every other day. That's not the correct approach. You have to let the plant communicate its needs to you. The same applies to garden watering in general. Understanding when to water is something acquired over time through experience and observation. We shouldn't just perform actions because they're supposed to be done. We should act based on the signals the plants provide, indicating what needs to be done. Next up, let's discuss some maintenance and also the protection of our plants. As we covered earlier, don't be unrealistic and assume animal pests won't arrive. Well, the same principle applies to insect pests, because I assure you, once you have some beautiful plants growing, the season will progress and the pests will begin to appear. What we must do is be preventative and proactive, establishing some forms of protection before they arrive. This way, we avoid struggling to manage and address the problem after it has already manifested. The first step we can take is utilizing some of the companion planting techniques discussed earlier to help deter pests and also to confuse some of them. Plants with strong scents like marigold are a good option. Marigold helps repel some pests and also confuses them with its odor. It also aids in deterring certain organisms like nematodes. Something like basil is excellent too. It possesses a pleasant, strong scent that helps repel and deter some pests, such as aphids. So there are certain crops with strong odors and other characteristics that assist in deterring some pests. They are beneficial options to integrate into our garden because they often serve as crops for us as well. They offer multiple functions and are simply great additions to the garden. Another tool we can employ is physical barriers. Personally, I am fond of using insect netting, particularly on my raised beds. Almost every single raised bed I cultivate in the spring gets covered with insect netting because numerous pests arrive that can cause issues and seek to lay eggs on your plants, which then hatch into other problematic stages. For example, concerning my cabbages and all my brassicas, my cauliflower, my broccoli, we encounter an insect called the cabbage white butterfly. It's this white butterfly that flits around, lands on the cabbage, and then deposits eggs. Those eggs develop into small cabbage worms, which will consume all your cabbage plants. It's incredibly annoying, and the cabbage butterflies are ubiquitous. So what I do is place insect netting over my bed. preventing those cabbage butterflies from accessing my plants. They cannot lay their eggs, so I don't have to be concerned about them. I can simply protect my plants in that manner. One consideration is if you intend to use insect netting, especially on crops requiring pollination, like cucumbers. You need to ensure you remove that netting when the plants begin to flower. This allows bees to enter and actually pollinate your plants. You might wonder, what's the purpose of the insect netting then? Well, the insect netting is beneficial because you don't need to remove it until the plants start flowering. Plants are most vulnerable to pest and disease damage during their younger stages. Once they become more established, they are less likely to succumb to some of that damage. If part of your cucumber pest problem involves specific pests, then you could cultivate certain kinds and varieties of cucumbers that attract fewer pests. This relates back to our earlier discussion on variety selection. There are cucumbers known as burpless cucumbers. These cucumbers lack a chemical compound called cucurbitacin. This compound is what causes burping after eating cucumbers. It's also responsible for bitterness in cucumbers, and it's the substance that attracts the cucumber beetle. When we grow varieties that are burpless and possess low levels of cucurbitacin, they won't attract as many cucumber beetles. It's quite fascinating how we can utilize plants that not only deter pests, but also select plants less susceptible to certain issues. If you do observe some bugs on your plants, you can simply go out there and remove them by hand. That's one method. It's effective, but it won't resolve the underlying issue long term. Instead, what you can do is utilize some organic sprays. Some that I particularly like are BT. It's an incredible option. It's organic and derived from a naturally occurring soil bacterium. This works exceptionally well for any type of worm, including cabbage worms, apple maggots, and similar pests. Spinosad, effective for many similar pests. For soft-bodied insects like aphids, you could use either neem oil spray or safer soap. Both are. Another strategy you can employ involves what are known as trap crops. Some plants attract pests, and completely eradicating the pest or avoiding dealing with it can be very difficult. For instance, squash vine borers arrive, and protecting your plants from them is extremely challenging because squash plants are large, and keeping the squash vine borer off your squash is almost impossible. You could grow certain varieties less susceptible to it, like some types of gourds, but managing it remains difficult. What you can do is plant trap crops, essentially sacrificial crops that pests prefer to target. This way, they hopefully target those instead of your prized crops. The blue Hubbard squash serves as an excellent trap crop for your squash plants because squash vine borers strongly favor it. If you plant that in a specific location, they are more likely to target those plants instead of your valued ones. Another example involves cucumbers. The cucumber beetle is consistently problematic. If you wish to try cultivating a cucumber variety attractive to cucumber beetles, my approach is to plant amaranth adjacent to my cucumbers because it seems cucumber beetles prefer targeting the amaranth over my cucumbers. They end up consuming the amaranth, which I don't particularly want right next to my cucumbers, instead of attacking the cucumbers themselves. Utilizing trap crops is quite advantageous. If you notice insects crawling around in your garden, a good option is to apply some diatomaceous earth. This is also a natural product. You spread it on the ground, and insects dislike walking over it because it can physically abrade them. It's a useful option if you have ants or other insects moving into your garden. Another possibility is making some natural sprays yourself. You can create a spray using just garlic and dish soap. I've done this previously. It's not as potent as some of the other sprays I mentioned, but it's an at-home remedy that can help kill off and deter some pests. Ultimately, ensuring you maintain your garden and keep it relatively clean is advisable too. You don't want it so pristine that it's sterile, but you want it sufficiently tidy that you're not leaving plants with pest issues that could spread to other plants. The problem can escalate and become larger than necessary. Just a bit of neatness and upkeep can genuinely help you significantly. It's time to address almost every gardener's most disliked aspect of gardening: weeding. Mastering weeding will greatly benefit your garden overall. Let's delve into it. Weeds extract substantial nutrition and water from your plants, necessitating their immediate removal. If you permit weeds to become established, they will only generate more problems. It's always advisable to grab your weeds and remove them while they're young, because they will simply cause more issues later. We've discussed it extensively already, but mulch will significantly help reduce both airborne weed seeds landing and sprouting, and also help suppress weed seeds already present in the soil from germinating. There are several different methods for eliminating weeds. You can pull them by hand or utilize a tool. My recommendation is that after rainfall is an excellent time to go out and pull those weeds because the rain loosens the soil, making it much easier to extract the weed directly from the ground, roots included. That's our objective when weeding. Remove the roots along with the plant. Don't just pull the top portion, extract the roots. Some weeds, like crabgrass, require only a small piece of root to regenerate. So we must ensure we remove the roots whenever possible. For certain areas, such as walkways possibly made of concrete or similar materials, you can employ a flame weeder. It's a propane torch that incinerates the weeds instead of requiring manual removal. This concludes the section covering direct sowing, transplanting, watering, maintenance, pest protection, and weeding. However, perhaps the most crucial aspect regarding weeds is preventing them from flowering. For instance, a single dandelion plant might be acceptable, but if we allow that plant to flower and produce seed, it can disperse thousands of seeds. Thus, one problem can multiply into 1,000 problems if we permit our weeds to go to seed. We simply need to ensure we're pulling them out before that occurs. A few additional natural methods for attempting to eliminate weeds include using boiling water, pouring it on the plant to try to kill the weed if you prefer not to pull it. You could also use a water and vinegar spray. I would only employ that in an area where I'm not cultivating other types of plants. So, it's a task no one enjoys. Weeding is genuinely important, and my suggestion, if feasible, is perhaps, if you have children, assign the task to them. If you have local individuals around, enlist their help. Arrange a small trade-off. Offer them some of the harvest in exchange for assistance with some weeding, and then you might not even have to do it yourself. Now, let's discuss supporting our growing plants so they can continue to thrive. A little earlier, we touched upon peppers, how when we plant those in the ground, we anticipate that later in the season, once they bear those large bell peppers, they will become heavy and require some staking. So we want to ensure we stake them when we initially plant them in the ground. The same principle applies to some of our other plants that might need stakes. Eggplants that I cultivate, large varieties. They usually require stakes too. Tomatoes that I grow also need stakes. So we want to make sure we're staking the plants while they're young. This way we avoid encountering issues as they mature. Another task we need to perform is, when securing our plants to the stake, we want to ensure we're using a tie that is relatively soft. We want to avoid using something like a thin string that could cut into the stem of our plants. So we need to use something that will be gentle. In the past, I've taken old shirts, cut them into strips, and used those for tying. There are also professional plastic ties available, just something that won't injure your plants by cutting into them. Regarding my tomatoes and cucumbers, I utilize these really neat little tomato clips. They work exceptionally well and simply clip onto the plant. That's primarily what I prefer to use. Just ensure you don't employ anything that will cut into your plants. Another consideration is trellising our plants up a support structure. Our cucumbers, our tomatoes, I prefer trellising up a single string. Our cucumbers, our beans, even some of our melons can be grown up a fence or trellis. This enables us to maximize the utility of the space we have. It will enhance airflow, simplify maintenance, and generally contribute to a better overall growing experience. Concerning items like melons, cantaloupes, and watermelons, if you're growing begins to enlarge, we want to ensure we come by and provide support for those melons. What I've done previously is simply cut a piece of insect netting, tied it, and placed it underneath my melon. This way, it can support the melon, preventing it from becoming excessively long, too heavy, and then, upon ripening, detaching and cracking on the ground. So, some of our larger melons and similar fruits require us to ensure they are adequately supported. Regarding plants like tomatoes and even my cucumbers, I frequently prune them to encourage more of a single stem, particularly for my tomatoes. This allows me to grow them up a single stem, as I mentioned earlier. I cultivate 10 tomatoes in 10 square feet. Each has its own string to climb. So I prune my indeterminate tomatoes to grow up one stem along a string, which then permits me to grow numerous plants within a confined area. The truly fascinating aspect is after those tomatoes become very tall and begin reaching the top of the trellis, I implement a technique known as lowering and leaning. I take the string, press a button, release the string downwards, which lowers the entire plant. Then the plant is conveniently positioned at head height. This makes it easy to work on, easy to harvest, and everything is just well organized and accessible when you don't have to bend over or climb a ladder for tasks. So we need to support our plants. We need to maximize their potential by utilizing vertical space, and then we can genuinely leverage our space and time effectively. Let's discuss disease briefly and monitoring for diseases. The first action we should take is to be present in our garden frequently enough to observe when conditions appear to be changing and when diseases seem to be emerging. Spending time in the garden is always beneficial. The more time you invest in the garden, the better its overall performance will be, and you'll also gain more experience simply by being out there for extended periods. Whenever we observe any leaves that are damaged or potentially exhibit signs of disease, we want to remove them immediately. Furthermore, for some of those leaves, particularly diseased ones, we don't want to simply toss them into the compost pile. We should place them in the garbage can and remove them from the property entirely because we want to prevent the disease from spreading. Many of the practices I shared with you earlier relate to disease management because the most crucial aspect is focusing on disease prevention. So, if we execute some of these earlier steps correctly, the probability of encountering disease will be reduced. For instance, spacing. If our plants are positioned too closely together and lack adequate airflow, they could develop diseases and fungal issues simply because they aren't drying out quickly enough. But if we adhere to square-foot gardening principles, as discussed earlier, that will assist us with spacing, minimizing potential issues. Another factor is cultivating disease-resistant varieties. If we understand some prevalent local diseases and are aware of them, we can then plant varieties resistant to those specific issues, thereby avoiding having to deal with them. Proper watering practices also tie into disease management. If we consistently wet the leaves of our plants during watering, the likelihood of those plants experiencing disease problems increases significantly compared to watering only at the base. Additionally, any debris observed in the garden, if anything appears damaged, we don't want to just let that material sit. We should remove it from the garden. Again, it doesn't need to be perfectly spotless, but we aim for a relatively tidy garden. This prevents harboring diseases and spreading them to our plants. The best course of action is to go out there, monitor your garden, and look for early indications of disease problems. Suppose your tomatoes are beginning to yellow, and you start noticing slight signs of blight. The earlier we can detect that, remove the affected leaf, and then take it off the property, the better. One thing to consider, however, is let's say we use a pruner, like a Fisker's pruner, to cut off that diseased tomato leaf. We don't then want to take that same pruner and use it on another tomato plant. We need to ensure we sterilize it. So I'll simply use some isopropyl alcohol to sterilize my pruners. The overall concept is if a disease problem arises, we want to address it as quickly as possible. And then we want to take every possible measure to ensure we're not inadvertently spreading it to other plants. The moment has finally arrived. We've reached the harvesting stage. It's taken some time, but I'm glad we're here. Sharing everything with you has been an absolute pleasure, though, so I hope you guys derived genuine value from this video. If you did, please be sure to share it and perhaps watch it again later. Creating it required a bit of time, but it has been thoroughly enjoyable. Regarding harvesting, you don't want your fruit to become overripe. If your fruit is overripe, you shouldn't let it remain in the garden. Overripe fruit simply provides an excellent breeding ground for pests and diseases to harbor. So, you want to ensure you're removing fruit if it's overripe. You don't want it just sitting in the garden. When it comes to harvesting, especially items like strawberries and beans, you should harvest them in the morning or later in the evening. You don't want to harvest that can simply cause some stress to the plants. Also, why would you want to pick a strawberry when it's hot from the sun? It's preferable to gather it in the morning when it's cooler or even at night, when temperatures are slightly lower. When harvesting some of your other crops, say like squash, you want to make sure you're using a sharp knife and cutting the squash off at the base of the plant. You don't want to just go out there and snap it off, as you could potentially damage the plants. So, if you harvest correctly, you'll encourage more future harvests. You just want to ensure you're going out there and using a sharp knife for that purpose. Concerning items like squash and cucumbers, particularly summer squash, you're better off harvesting them when they're younger. So, cucumbers, if left on the vine too long, will not only start to taste somewhat sour and turn slightly yellow, but also, as they become more yellow and sour, they'll tend to become more bitter. As they grow more bitter, they produce increased amounts of that cucurbitacin, which subsequently attracts cucumber beetles. So, you want to ensure you're harvesting items like your cucumbers early and frequently. Once you observe a cucumber reaching basically whatever size you desire, you can harvest it. The same applies to your summer squash. Winter squash differs. It needs to ripen completely before harvesting. But for things like peas, summer squash, beans, and cucumbers, the more you pick, the more produce you'll receive. So it's always beneficial to pick them early and often. Just consider it for a moment. If you were a cucumber vine, your entire purpose in life is essentially to produce offspring to then grow more cucumbers in the future. So if a cucumber vine bears a cucumber and we allow that cucumber to ripen fully on the vine, enabling it to focus on creating viable seed, then the plant will simply concentrate on ripening that seed, considering it its future progeny. But if there's a small cucumber and we remove it, then the plant will be inclined to continue flowering, to then have another chance at producing a cucumber from which it can create seed. So, the more we pick, the more it will persist in putting out additional cucumbers. The same principle holds true for summer squash. So it might seem paradoxical, but for many of these items, picking them early and often is actually preferable. For some of your crops like potatoes and onions, you'll want to store them properly. Even before storage, you'll need to cure them. So we must consider proper storage and curing techniques when harvesting, and it's something we should contemplate before the harvest is even ready, essentially. Another point is if we do have overripe fruit, we don't want to simply discard it in the garbage can. That overripe fruit would be perfect for adding to a compost pile, provided we're managing a hot compost system, or even for feeding to chickens if you keep them. It'll serve as a great treat for them. So there are numerous uses for overripe fruit. We just don't want it lingering in the garden, essentially. Another practice you should adopt is recording your harvests and the specific varieties you're growing. This enables you to determine, for instance, on your property, perhaps one tomato variety performs better than others. Then you can conclude, that's one of the tomatoes I'm going to continue cultivating. Then you try that variety in a different location and perhaps discover, well, actually this tomato performs best in that spot. Over a period of years, you'll be able to refine precisely where you plant specific items and optimize the harvest you obtain. You can kind of, over time, create the ideal backyard garden where you're maximizing your time and space because you're relying on your own past data and using that information to guide future decisions. Contrary to what you might assume, harvesting isn't actually the final step. It's merely another stage in this recurring process of growing our food. That's why I enjoy growing, because it never truly concludes. The next phase is simply the subsequent cycle resetting, in a way. So, concerning harvesting, you should actually leave some plants if you intend to save seed from them. For instance, if you wish to save your own seed from a particular tomato or lettuce variety, one critically important aspect is ensuring you only save seeds from varieties that are either open-pollinated or heirloom. Those are the only types that will grow true to seed, meaning the offspring will resemble the parent plant. If you save seed from a hybrid variety, you will not obtain the same plant back. For example, if I'm growing a Super Sweet 100, which is a hybrid, if I save the seeds from that tomato and then plant them the following year, I will not get that Super Sweet 100 tomato plant again. I will likely get something leaning somewhat more towards its parent varieties because a hybrid is essentially two different open-pollinated varieties that have been deliberately crossed. That cross is what yields our hybrid. This is done for various reasons, such as enhancing disease resistance, achieving larger harvests, or addressing other factors. So, we only want to be saving seed from open-pollinated and heirloom varieties. It's crucial that we adhere to that. Another thing is, it's amusing. I have these little birds behind me that I can just hear scurrying around. They've been squabbling back and forth all morning. They seem aware I'm observing them, so it's slightly distracting, but it's actually quite funny to hear the pitter-patter of their movements back there. It's rather nice. So, if there are some crops from which we're not saving seed and they've completed their cycle for the year, a neat practice, especially if you have a food forest environment, is simply employing the chop and drop method. Particularly for my asparagus, this is my approach when the asparagus has finished growing. When there's no green remaining, and it's entirely brown, what I do is I'll cut the asparagus stalks down at ground level, then take those asparagus ferns and simply drop them onto the ground over the asparagus crowns. This helps protect the crown, serving as a form of mulch throughout the winter. So, it's an effective way to utilize some of that plant material at the end of the year as mulch. Another consideration is wood chipping for the upcoming year. So, this year, I'll engage in some wood chipping. I do this every couple of years. I believe I applied these current wood chips about 2 years ago. Then, around this time of year, or perhaps even in February, is when I prefer to go out and handle all my wood chipping tasks. It's best accomplished before everything awakens. It makes navigating the garden much easier, and there's significantly less risk of causing any damage to your plants. So it's advisable to get your wood chipping and soil mulching completed right now. This way, when the busy season arrives, you won't have to worry about it. You won't have to contend with weeds. Undertaking some garden projects before the season commences is beneficial. Then, when things become extremely hectic during the season, those tasks are simply things you genuinely don't need to concern yourself with. Another action you should take is reviewing all of your notes in your journal to identify what proved successful. Allocate some time for introspection to examine everything, analyze outcomes, and pinpoint areas where improvements could be made. Then, based on the information gathered from the preceding year and all previous years, you can plan the following year's garden. So, there's a high probability that I'll achieve fairly good success in my garden this year because I possess essentially 15 years of knowledge, experience, journals, and notes to draw upon. Achieving success becomes considerably easier when you can rely on all that past experience. So that's the position I aim to guide you guys towards. That's the reason I created a video like this, because I'm attempting to share everything I've learned with you in just one video format where you can play it like a podcast and listen, or just absorb it in segments. It contains a substantial amount of information, but it's intended as a comprehensive information transfer to provide you guys access to it and allow you to utilize it to your advantage. My preferred style of gardening leans more towards a permaculture approach, where I enjoy incorporating. I have this food forest, and I like integrating annuals and raised beds into it. So, it involves blending a few different gardening styles. But ultimately, my favorite practice is collaborating with nature, rather than working entirely against it. To combat nature, we must erect our barriers and ensure we secure the crops we're cultivating. But fundamentally, if you can work in harmony with nature, if you can implement practices like companion planting, utilize tools like insect netting, and actually become part of the natural process, moving forward with it instead of being completely oppositional, it will result in a superior garden, a more joyful garden, a garden teeming with life. That's why we have all the birds and everything present here, because a garden like this, a food forest, isn't just a paradise for humans. It's a paradise for every living organism, and that's where I prefer to spend my time, in a paradise. That concludes today's video, growers. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you gained something valuable from it. This one was certainly lengthy, and we've been out here filming for quite a considerable time. It's been highly enjoyable. I mean, we've had dogs barking, school letting out nearby, planes flying overhead. So, it's been quite entertaining. We trust you guys derive genuine value from this video. I felt it was an opportune moment to create a video like this, to simply convey a wealth of information to you, just so you can kind of extract, we have a lot happening, just so you guys can take the specific pieces from it that you believe will offer you value. Even if there are just 3 or 4 nuggets of information that could enhance your overall harvest, it motivates you to grow, and then you actually share your activities with other people. That's our entire philosophy with Team Grow. So it revolves around teaching you to grow, growing alongside you, and then encouraging and inspiring you to subsequently share that knowledge with others, prompting them to start gardens, and it just becomes this rapidly expanding phenomenon. So, we're truly grateful that you're watching this video, that you're part of Team Grow, and that you've dedicated time to learning something new. We'd love to see some of your pictures from the garden. So, over at my Team Grow website, we now have an entire community there where everyone shares extensively about their gardening activities. We assist one another. So, if you wish to be part of the community where we're helping each other grow and collectively building and cultivating a better future, check that out over at teamgrow.us. I also wanted to extend a thank you to one of our recent channel members, Diane G. Ford. Thanks for being a part of Team Grow. Thanks for contributing to everything we're undertaking out here. We're approaching the time when we begin planting things in the ground. The items inside are looking very promising. We're just on the verge of transitioning from a garden that's essentially empty to one brimming with abundance. It's genuinely enjoyable to be able to bring you guys along for that journey. The contrast between now and June is incredible. It's something I cherish being a part of, and it's something you guys should experience too. So you absolutely need to establish a garden and start cultivating in your backyard if you haven't already.